just like to introduce Professor John Fairclough, who has very kindly joined us from the UK. He's an honorary consultant orthopaedic surgeon and emeritus professor in sports and exercise medicine. He's been involved in the development of sports medicine and research in Wales and nationally, with specific involvement in Welsh Rugby Union at club and international level. John has a whole wealth of research behind him in the area of sports injuries. He's played an active role in the development of Progressive Rugby, which is a group that both myself and Ed are part of. And we're very much looking forward to his overview of concussion today and hearing about some of the work that he's been involved in. So I'd like you to join me in welcoming John to come and to open up our session. So thanks, John.
Good evening, everyone. It's wonderful to be here. It's the first time I've been this far to the east of Wales for a long, long time. I'm a member of a group called Progressive Rugby. Now, it doesn't mean that I'm dealing purely with rugby tonight, but we got together to look at concussion because, sorry, just next slide, let's see this. Next slide. Because we were noticing that many of our players who we'd known from the 1970s were starting to get problems. This is one of them. This is a man called Alex Popham. And I knew him when he was a player, and he started to develop early dementia. And that was not uncommon. So we started to look a little bit into it. And as a consequence, when you see Twitter and when you see the website, you'll see there's a lot of people both in rugby, in management, in physiotherapy, and in medicine. Next slide, please. Now, I'm going to mention 3 films tonight. Not usual for an orthopedic surgeon, but they are Rollerball, they are Mr. Kawasaki, and then we'll come on to the other one in later. But this is a film called Rollerball. You can see here that in the 1970s, this film came out. But in the World Cup, I noticed there were a lot of increased injuries in rugby, and the times I referred to rugby as becoming like rollerball. And you can see what I mean. This was a sport which was played in the future, which was supposed to be in the 2030s, where individuals were trying to get a ball from one part of the pitch to the other. And you can see this, despite the fact that there were rules, a head injury occurs. And as a consequence, there was an injury. Well, when you look at many of the things we see in rugby today, you see similar concussions. Now, as a consequence of the increasing number of concussions that were occurring in sport, what happened was that the government of the UK got a committee together, and a number of individuals got together to extract what evidence they had in the various different areas of sport. And Kieran Bracken and myself presented to this. The report came out earlier this year. But when we look at concussion in sport, the problem is we don't know the incidence. And the reason for that is because the surveillance of head injuries is very difficult. We don't know how many hours people play. We don't know what happens, what is classified as a concussion. But we do know that contact sports have a large number of head injuries producing concussion. So that's why we got together and formed this group, looking to see whether we could put some form of order and present, particularly to the World Rugby, our view of how rugby perhaps could be safer. And the reason for that is not because we're shroud wavers, but we are aware that in the past, various sports have been involved with concussion, and it's been a real problem. If you look at the bottom left of the screen, you'll see that there's a fight there. This is 2 boxers. One is Chris Eubank, the other is Watson. As a result of that fight, Watson had a very serious head injury, and it was found on litigation that there was a liability to the British Boxing Board of Control, and they were nearly bankrupted. At the top, you can see a paper, Clinical Evolution of Chronic Traumatic Encephalopathy. And this was done approximately 8 years ago. And it was found that even in young people in American football, they were seeing changes in the brain. So concussion does seem to have changes which occur and which can be accumulative. And sorry, I'll just go back one slide. You notice at the bottom there, there's an Irishman, one of your best outside house, in fact, one of the best I've seen, Sexton. And look, he had 4 injuries in a very short time. And we have to question as to whether the brain can recover during that period. There is an author, Lewis Carroll, wrote a book, Alice Through the Looking Glass. And in one of the characters in there is called Humpty Dumpty. And he said, words mean what I want them to mean. And that's true of concussion, because each one of you sitting here will have your own view of what concussion is. Now, of course, it's got many different meanings, but look at the situation here. Top left-hand side, you'll see an injury. See the Everton goalkeeper being hit by, the Everton player hitting the Tottenham goalkeeper. Now, look what he says. The manager says he was in a bad way, but by the time he came around, he was wanting to stay on. He's a little dazed, but he's a lot better. Now, question yourself as to whether you think that man had a head injury which was sufficient to allow him to stay on. He then was challenged later on, and it was found that he probably was wrong. That's a football injury. So what is a concussion? Well, a concussion is when the brain moves inside the skull. Of course, it can be from an impact, and the brain turns round and can cause some significant changes. But it's not always an impact. I'm sorry, I am a medic. When you find this is a little bit difficult to watch, please turn away. But if you watch the impact here, can you see how that head whips backwards? And that's one of the things that occurs in some injuries. The brain is actually moving inside the skull. If you look at a cadaver, you can see that the cadaver itself, the skull is bigger than the brain, and the brain is in a sea. So as the brain actually moves, it can damage these small blood vessels, but more importantly, inside the brain, there are little, almost like wires, very fine wires. These are the cells, these are the neurons. Now they get damaged. There is an alteration in their ability to actually communicate messages across. So when did they recover? The answer to that is we don't know, because we can't get inside. You can do animal experiments, but it's still unknown. Now, look at the left-hand side, and you can see a fight, and it's Khan falling to the floor, and watch him trying to get up. Now, this is a boxer trying to get up after being hit. As you can see, he's trying to get to his feet, but he falls over. Now, he was knocked out, technical knockout. Leaves the ring, can't box for 30 days. Now look at this, only a few weeks ago, England v Wales. Look at the man lying on the ground, Thomas Francis. Remember the boxer, watch him try and get up. See, falls down. Now he stands up, rocks against the post. Now he puts his head in his hands. Now he's seen by an individual. He went back to play after head injury assessments. I'll let you understand. Again, if you don't want to watch, don't watch this. But here's a punch, which is hit, done in slow motion. Now watch the lips as this punch is hit. And what you will find is that the head moves, but remember the brain is inside that skull. And as it hit, the lips are moving forwards. Now that movement is occurring within the brain. So you're having that type of force applied to the cerebral tissue. Now, when individuals do get injured and they have a concussion, they fall to the ground, but it is their cognitive ability, their ability to actually make decisions which is altered. And you can see that here, the player is arguing in the last World Cup about whether he should come off. But the next day he says he's sorry. He didn't know where he was. It was because he was dizzy. But there is more than just the event themselves. There is some evidence that we can have a thing called second impact syndrome. Some people don't believe this, but certainly in my career, I have seen one individual, a 16-year-old Welsh boy who was injured in this way. But this is a Northern Irish child who died, and it was after having an injury early on in the game. Whether or not it was causative, we don't know. There wasn't enough. But it's certainly a risk. If you are concussed, you have a risk of having a second injury. But as a consequence of all this knowledge, my colleague is going to talk a little bit about concussion assessments later on, we have come with schemes to try and assess what is and is not safe, what is a concussion. And the head injury assessments, which you'll have heard so much about in the Six Nations, is a common thing that's done, as is the recovery, the return to play. But let's look at it in reality. This was, in fact, sorry if I can go back again. Can we play this? This is a game. Jamie Roberts is, in fact, a doctor. And what I ask you to do is to just watch this impact. Can you see the impact? Now they fall to the floor. One of those players fractures his skull. The other one goes up. The one with the fractured skull, which is Jamie Roberts, carries on playing the game. Now, what you have to ask yourself is, should we have had a mechanism by which he could have got off the pitch? Was the head injury assessment, which wasn't present then, would it have actually picked that up? As we've said, the trouble is that when you start asking players, they can't give you the straight answer, because once they're in a position that they've had a head injury, they make bad decisions. So why is a player allowed to play on? And any of you here are involved in sport, you know the situation. If you've had it yourself, you want to stay on. There is the problem, you might not recognize it, but sometimes it is quite obvious. If you don't recognize it, well, there should be in elite rugby somebody watching. In other sports, you've got to watch yourselves. It's the other players, it's the spectators who should also be a part of looking. There is a thing called the Goldman dilemma. It's again worthwhile looking at. There's some questioning about how how much veracity there is in this. But it was said that if you gave a tablet to a certain number of people and you guaranteed them a gold medal, would they actually take that tablet if it was going to kill them in 5 years? And about half of them said yes. Now, it has been challenged, but certainly my experience is that people do have a goal and they will get it at all costs. But it's the last one of those, which is the wish of the manager, which I think is the most important. And for all of you here, whether you're mums and dads or club individuals, the wanting to get on, the wanting to win, is something that gets into everybody. In the heat of the moment, you do not want that player to come off. If it was Johnny Wilkinson, the England-Australian game, just before the end and he got a head injury, would the doctor have taken him off? It's a very difficult situation. But the rule is, if you have a concussion, you shouldn't go on and play. And I feel very strongly that the benefit must always be on the side of erring to caution. We do know when you look at scans which are taken late on, that there is abnormality. But the problem is you can't do a CAT scan, an ME scan, an MRI scan, a PET scan on the day. So everything is always done later. But there is an interesting paper that has come out fairly recently. And this was looking at an MRI scan. And what an MRI scan is, it's not an anatomical scan. It's actually a water scan, because what happens is the magnet moves around and all the water molecules in the tissue point towards where the magnet is. Then you switch the magnet off. That's the clinking you hear. All the molecules fall back and it gives you a gradient map as the electricity or the electric charge comes up. And what we showed, or it wasn't my paper, what they showed was that even at 3 weeks, the small number of people still had changes in the white matter, although there were some changes and some recovery quite early on. At 3 weeks, there was still some changes, and that's a worry, because it means there's no absolute safe time. So I'm suggesting that the measurements that we take are always going to be an approximation. Very complicated slide, and please don't read it all, but what it does, it shows the journey that we've had in rugby union from the time when I was a young doctor in the early 70s, when we first started the 3-week rule. If you had a concussion, you couldn't go on for 3 weeks, you couldn't play for 3 weeks. The problem was that a lot of people cheated because they wanted to get banned. But they then started to go on to graduated return to play. And the problem was this was all mediated on a certain reliance on the SCAT scan and the HIA were objective. We've always been very concerned about that in progressive rugby because we do not believe that the brain can recover in 6 days and get them back to play. If you look at the natural history of concussion in the few papers we had, this one comes from Australia. And if you look at the two graphs, the blue line, on the side, the axis going up the side is the percentage of people. So the blue line is the percentage of people not playing. So as the line comes down, you can see that by 6 days, most people were back playing. But if you look at the red line is the recovery of the cognitive thought processes. So you can see that even though they've gone back to play at 6 days, at 6 days, they've still got some cognitive loss. So there is some measurable loss at that time they go back. And that by the time they're at 3 weeks, there's still some 17% change. Now, it's only one paper, but ask any teacher who's had a child what the maths is like at a few weeks, and you find that most children still have a mathematical problem several weeks after the injury. However, what we can say, the majority of people do get better. It's not a major problem for most people, but it does take longer in women and children. We're dealing with 90%, 98% of rugby specifically played in the amateur sport. It's in clubs and schools. And we do have a different return to play in the United Kingdom. It's 19 days for community before they go back, and it's 23 days for for the schools. Now, what I'd like you to do is, this is a schools game, and perhaps we can later on look at this, but what I'd like you to do is to just look at the young boy here, the number 16, and what happens as the number 10 hits him. He hands him off. Now, he hits him in the head, but watch what happens to his head as he lands. So that's not the impact of the hand that's causing the problem, but the head. Now, just watch the other, as we let this run through, watch what happens. These are all the same age children. Okay? All right. Now, you've all been there. You've all seen this. So the question is how do you teach tackling to be safe on that child? Okay. Now, the women's game is also a problem, because the difficulty about women's rugby, especially in Wales, is women don't play rugby in schools. They tend to only play rugby at university, so they tend to pick up the game relatively later. And what we know of concussion in many sports, if you look at the sex ratio, is more women get concussed than men per incident games. In other words, you look at the hours played. I know one of my colleagues is going to talk about this later again, but there is a sex difference. Now, if we look at what happens here, again, can you see that that's a very, very similar situation if we just go back and watch again. As she's hit, it's the whiplash effect, and it's the head hitting the ground because they don't have the stability in the neck muscles, because basically they didn't spend all the times in the lifting the weights in their early teens. And there is a huge risk factor there. At the elite level, we had a discussion with World Rugby about the return to play, and it was felt that it was safe to go back in earlier stages. We did have, we hope, some effect, and they did change the training and contact ratios, because obviously the more times you're impacted, the more times your brain is going to be likely to be injured. So the less contact training hours you have, the better. But again, I make no excuses for playing this again. Here we have a situation of a man. Now, what I would ask you is, each of you may not be medics, you may not be physiotherapists. Is that man concussed? Now, let's have a look again at a similar situation. And what I would ask you to do is to just look at what he does here. Here you can see the man going to get the ball in a thing called a jackal. He's going to get the ball. But watch his head. He's going for the ball. He looks up and then he's hit. Again. He's going for the ball. He looks up and then he's hit. So he's getting a head injury because of the mechanism of the sport that he's playing. Now, rugby, and it's true of most of the sports, has seen a phenomenal change. Our rugby players have become bigger, and part of the problems I have is that we've actually started to substitute, and I cannot see the reason why we permit this many substitutes, because it means that people who are very big, bulky, who could not last 80 minutes, can now go on and only play 60 minutes, because there's been a 25% increase in momentum. Now that means that those impacts you're having are much greater than they ever were. And this is just a graph which demonstrates that since 1955 to 2015, you've had a gradual increase in body mass, but that is also associated not with bulk, but with pace as well. Now, can we measure concussion? Well, there's been lots of different attempts, and this is one of them at the moment, which is looking at instrumented gum shields. And there is also other measurements which are for microRNAs, but none of them have as yet been specific and given us enough information to say that this can specifically rule out a concussion. And of course, for children and for club rugby, these are very expensive and unlikely to be immediately available. So what's my conclusions? Well, a bit like Socrates, I know what I don't know. The concussion, it's a common injury, but we don't have a reliable marker. The symptoms and the variability for recovery is vast. Children and women are more at risk. We do need education. I think it's fantastic, Lisa, of you all here, to have this program, which actually allows us to show that there is a means of actually hopefully addressing this situation in the future. But we do need research, because if we don't get this right, we're all sports lovers and we're rugby union lovers, because if we don't reduce the number of concussions and the consequences of it, somebody will say it's too dangerous to play. Thank you very much indeed. Diolch yn fawr i nos da.